Hello, welcome to my Sprint YouTube update for sprint number 5. First, I'm going to talk about our division of work. Next, I'm going to demo our newly added features to our application. Then I'm going to go into GitHub and talk about some of my check-ins and highlight some of the new code I added. And finally, I'll go into Team Gantt and talk about my last sprint tasks and then go over the next sprint tasks that I have. So first of all, this is our division of work. So my main task involved implementing the member permissions screen and all of the backend for that. And once that was done, I decided to help Max with his add new member screen, and as well as added a calendar activity indicator and some additional calendar stylings that I had time to add. I'll go ahead and demo our best features from the last sprint. Once I sign in, you'll immediately see the activity indicator. Once I sign in correctly, so right there, that little circle, because I wanted the application to finish gathering all the data before it actually loads, so that it doesn't load in bits and pieces. The first major update was our meal history, thanks to Brandon. And he's got some ratings here. If you click into them, you can rate even further. So that is super awesome. And then another update was member permissions. If I go into this family meal pod here, if I go ahead and manage members, I can click on any of these two. So how about Brandon? And I can go ahead and edit, toggle his permissions right here, and they will update in our database in real time. And just to show you what I'm talking about, if I go into high school friends, which I'm a member of, I can, this will be fixed later. I can manage myself. I'll fix this, but I can disable can edit. If I go ahead and load back into high school friends, you can see now that editing the meal pod will be disabled, and I cannot click into it. Those are some of the biggest complete features that we had from the last sprint. I'll go ahead and I'll talk about some of my check-ins. So I had 5, let's see, 5, this is not mine. I don't know why this is highlighted. 5 main check-ins from the last sprint. I'll go through each one of them one by one. First off with adding React switches and reading routed data in the permissions screen. This right here for the member management screen, since Max and I were working on screens that directly navigated from the member management, I just wanted to make sure that Brandon's code was a little more complete and a little bit more readable and just stylized so that it's, making the screen a little more stylized so that it's a little easier to work with. That's all that this is. Right here, though, down in the permission screen, if I scroll down, yeah, right here. So when we tap on a user in our member management, we already know which member that we are editing permissions for. So all we need for our state is the permissions array, which is basically just a binary array or a Boolean array, where each index represents the specific permission. So we have a toggle switch function, which is called every single time that the switch is tapped on, and all it does is it inverts the value in that index, and then it sets the state. I haven't implemented it yet at this point to update to Firestore, so I left that for the next update check-in. Let's go ahead and talk about that. So right here, I could remove that to do, no problem. Implemented this function right here, set Firestore permissions, where it passes in the new permissions that we want to update and the member that we want to update it for. and we just look for that document based on its ID, and we go ahead and set those new permissions and merge that change with the original document. Next was, I think, the hardest part of this was to be able to update what the user saw, or basically what the user could interact with on the screen based on these permissions. What I needed to do is once navigated to the pod management screen, I didn't know which member that the current user was associated with. So I had to get the user's member status, or I had to check the user's member status, but also check their admin status, because I'll have to render differently based on if they were an admin or a member. And once I found that, right here I have four buttons here. So I have an edit pod info button, and then I have a manage members button, which you saw in our demo. But we need two versions of each of them, one that's enabled and one that's disabled. We had to know, first of all, whether the current user was an admin or a member. And the difference between the two is that admins don't have permissions. So everything is unlocked for an admin. So all we had to check was if their permissions array did or didn't exist. If it did, then we can assume that the user was a member, and we can render the buttons as if they were. Otherwise, we can render them as if they were an admin. If they're an admin, we can just render the enabled buttons. Easy as that. If they were a member, I had to create a flat list and associate each button and render them based on their permissions in the permissions array. So over here, when it's rendered, this function's called, and I basically have a ternary that checks the index of those permissions. This will tell us whether we're rendering an edit pod info button or a manage members button, and then the value of the data in that index will tell us if we are rendering it as enabled or disabled. That was really interesting. I'm really proud of this, actually. My biggest challenge was that I was programming in a function component. Earlier in my last videos, I was implementing components as a class. So I'm kind of proud that I figured out how to use React Native state and syntax when using a function component, and Firestore with a function component. There's not many examples online yet about how to use Firestore with function components. Then my last two check-ins. So this is just for the activity indicator. We already had this loading value, and I knew exactly what it was for once I borrowed it from online. So all I had to do was check this value, the loading value, and if we're no longer loading, then we can go ahead and load the rest of the screen. Otherwise, we'll enable our activity indicator. That was pretty straightforward. And then experimenting with some calendar and pod management stylings, such as rounding edges, adding some icons, just making it look a little cleaner, because I know styling may become important coming at the end of our semester. So I wanted to get a little more familiar with that. Anyways, so my tasks for sprint cycle number 5, the main one here was the member permission screen. I started with the component layout and the front end. Once I was confident with that, I went ahead and went to the back end, which was, that's what I did for that. And then finally, once I was through with the member permission screen, I could help Max with his add new member screen that we worked on together, and the calendar activity indicator. and calendar stylings, of course. For the next sprint, um, I plan to basically continue what Max and I had worked on for the add new member screen, because Max seems really interested in working on the profile screen. I didn't want to stop him with that. So, um, plus the rest of the work that needs to be done for it is just, I think, front end, and we completed the back end together. So I think that will not be a problem. My main task, though, involves adding a new pod to our account. Um, First of all, I wanna create a backend where I can just update Firestore and add a new pod, uh, just without the context of how it would be done in our application. Then I could worry about the front end later. And I have to decide whether or how we might be able to repurpose some of our screens, because our original idea was to have the screen layout the same whether we're editing a pod or adding a new one. Um, because changing permissions or um, editing the info of the pod should be the same, right? So, and I'll just have to do a little research and understand our platform or our app structure a little more to do that. Um, yeah, for the last sprint, all these numbers, I'll just add them up. I'll just show the added up value for all of that. I worked on all of these in the same week, so they all added up to 13 hours and 46 minutes. And that was my contribution to sprint number 5. So thank you, and I will see you in class.